In 1972, Michael H Hart published a book called The 100, a ranking of the most influential persons in history. Coming in at number 1 was Muhammad, the prophet and founder of Islam. So it's not surprising that a lot of Muslim commentators comment on this book. In at number 3 we find Jesus. Now what may surprise people, considering that I am a Christian, is that I have no problem with Michael Hart putting Muhammad in at number 1, or at least in the top 10. Let me explain why. I'm a sucker for a list of top of whatever, as long as it is something I am interested in. So for example, I will get drawn in by the 10 best footballers, soccer players if you're in the US, or the 10 best guitar players or drummers. Sometimes I see on a news channel the top 10 or 50 ranked songs by an artist, or films by an actor or director, and if it's something I'm interested in, I will take a look. What draws us all to these types of lists is that we like to compare and see if we agree. Would we put it in this order? Are there some in there that make you go, what? Are you on drugs or something? You know what I mean. Now looking at Hart's list of 100, there are definitely some on there and some not on there, and some of the ordering that I find very suspect. It will take all my willpower not to get into that. But all that aside, I will say that I agree that both Muhammad and Jesus most definitely belong in the top 100. The key word here is the word influential. I think the mistake that many make about the list is that it is about greatness or their genius or their goodness. But to have an influence in the world doesn't mean it has to be about being the best or the fastest or the greatest. And it doesn't mean it has to be a positive force in the world. I think sometimes even Hart made that mistake. To give you an example, Hart put Newton at number 2, so higher than Jesus, and Einstein at number 10. Now these two are two of the greatest scientific minds of all time. And while Newton probably had a greater effect on society with his basic principles being the foundation for further discoveries than Einstein did, it's hard to think of many ways that Einstein's theories have changed the world. As yet anyway. But Charles Darwin, on the other hand, who I don't even think should be called a scientist, has had a massive influence on the world. His so-called theory of evolution has entered the minds of millions of people who believe it to be a scientific fact, and it has affected their beliefs and morals, sometimes with horrific consequences. So in short, in my list, Darwin, who comes in at number 16 on Hart's list, would be higher than either Newton or Einstein on the basis of influence, but not in a list based on great scientists. Which brings us to Jesus and Muhammad. As I said, even though I am a Christian, I have no problem putting Muhammad high up in the list of influencers on the world. I am basing this on the standard narrative of Muhammad that Islam would put forward. Now that standard narrative is becoming very much challenged, but for the sake of this study, let us go with it. Certainly something has had a large effect on the world, even if it's not all down to Muhammad, because we have a religion that has reached something like 1.6 to 1.8 billion people in the world. That is something like 22% of the world population that are followers of Islam. It is the fastest growing religion in the world, which is due to its high birth rate. It is a religion that has strict control of its followers and shapes every part of their lives and death. It is beyond doubt that the religion of Muhammad is one of the largest influences in the world. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of influence is it? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neutral? I will return to that question in my conclusion. With Jesus, the situation is different. For sure, Jesus wants to influence the world. We have in the Lord's Prayer, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." It is different because Jesus doesn't expect to be loved, but rather hated. He said this, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you." And this is from the Gospel of John 15, 18 and 19. And then in verse 25 it says, "They hated me without a reason." Notice in the first quote that hatred spreads to the followers of Jesus. And in fact, this has always been the case. In Matthew 5 verse 12, Jesus says on the subject of persecution, This, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In despite of all this rejection of Jesus and his message, Jesus had a massive effect on the world. This has happened in two forms. Firstly, those who believed his message of salvation and have become his disciples. This is what God wants to happen and is his sole intention for the world. The second is the effect he has had through his church, which has led to a form of cultural Christianity. Now, cultural Christianity is what you can get in a society when people may not be Christians themselves, but have grown up in its values and habits. Jesus told us that we were to be the salt of the earth and to do good works. These two forces working in alignment with people's God-given consciences has had a large effect on societies throughout the world. Often the effects are subtle and people don't even know that they are there. You can even observe the amount of effect on different societies in proportion to the influence of the church in that society. This is why people want to live in Europe and Northern America. What I'm saying here is that there's a whole culture in these places that owes a lot of its laws, expectations and habits to the Christian influence, even though the number of genuine Christians may be small. In most of these countries, that influence is waning, and we are seeing the consequences among the young who are starting to lack clear guidance for their lives and are pushing back against what Christianity would say is a moral way to go, and instead replacing it with their own values. Cultural Christianity is not what God's objective for the world was, but has been a happy consequence of the spread of Christianity. So in conclusion, a lot of fuss has been made about Hart's book by Muslim leaders and apologists, as though it has settled the argument about who is the greatest. But as I have shown, influence does not equal greatness. Also, it does not equal truth, and that is the most important thing in God's eyes. My list for most influential would most definitely have Jesus at number 1, because his influence will last forever and ever. For the influence, it may have Muhammad at number 2 and Darwin at number 3. And the top 10 would have people like Karl Marx and Hitler. For greatness, it would definitely have Jesus in at number 1 slot, but I'm not sure who would come in at number 2, but it would not be Muhammad or Darwin. Someone may come in at number 2, but the gap between them and Jesus would be greater than the width of the known universe. So to sum up, we must not confuse influence with greatness or importance or goodness. The list of people of influence will consist of some dodgy people who have had a negative effect on the world, but the list of people who have had a positive effect on the world will be a different list, with some of the same names appearing, but the order will be different. The question is, would Muhammad be on this list? I've made my opinion clear. What is your opinion?